Glad to see you everyone today. I'm gonna give you more of a storytelling panel, less of theory, more of, I hope, inspiration for the future taken from the past. As the name implies, well, Proto-Anarchist doesn't in this case mean a previous thing that would lead later to anarchism. It's more of a primitive form of human government that pretty much resembles what later in more, let's say, developed societies we would term anarchism, as a way of personal freedom without restraints of any upper institutions. And that I think is just a natural way for people to behave when they have a clear, direct relation with their natural environment, and when they don't really have constraints of too many people in this environment. So most people, when they think of Prussians, when they hear the name Prussians, they got the image of pickelhaube wearing gentlemen, perhaps Bismarck, and also a model of state, a model of livelihood that's as far away from any sorts of anarchism as possible. Basically, one of the proto-forms of what would later probably become fascism. But the original Prussians, called Old Prussians, normally in English language, were very far away from it, and their only relation with the later, let's say, New Prussians is the name that was stolen by mostly German-speaking settlers that settled in the region of Baltic. The image on the left gives you a clue on how that happened. It was a political strategy of the contemporary leaders of Polish princedoms. Poland was not a unified political entity at the moment. It was a bunch of princedoms. And one of them, Konrad of Mazovia, he decided to clean up the area northeast of his domain, of these pesky barbarians that he had trouble with for quite some time. Various missionaries were going from Polish territories to Prussia, and also various military campaigns were carried out by former and also contemporary Polish kings and princes that tried to establish some sort of dominance over Prussians. But since their model of governance was not really possible to incorporate into this feudal model, all of these sorts of attempts were completely useless. And so he decided to go for the model known already in broader Europe and invite a knight order to his territory to get the job done. And so he did. That was the Teutonic Order, the Order of the Hospitallers of the Saint Mary of the House of Jerusalem, if I remember correctly. So he settled them on a piece of land there. They, long story short, did warfare against the Prussians. They uprooted their systems and later on established their own state. So while they were doing this, while they were conquering land, in order to pacify it, in order to create a different sort of relationship with the land, they had to bring settlers from their native land, the Germans. And so the people that settled there, the people who were living there after the Prussians were gone, or more right would be to say they were already trampled, they started calling themselves from the land they were living in, which was Prussia. They knew the name Prussia, so that's just how they called themselves. The Prussians that I'm going to talk about are related very closely to modern Lithuanians and Latvians. They are part of the Baltic language group. And they had a lot of connections, linguistic connections to to steppe peoples also, which distinguished them from other Baltic communities. They had a lot of cultural curiosities among them, which shows us sort of where some pieces of their culture might come from. Here is a map of the area of modern-day Poland, part of Lithuania, and also the Kaliningrad Oblast, the place that used to be known historically as Eastern Prussia. As you can see, they were divided into tribal areas that were controlled by sort of federations of different territories. Federations of tribal territories. On the broadest level, a tribe was a big unit of smaller areas, basically constituting of even smaller fields. And the smallest unit of organization in Prussian society, it would be a single field inhabited by anywhere from 1 to around 20 homesteads. One homestead would, on average, maintain about 20, 30 people, one family, basically one extended family, and all the slaves that were also living in that homestead. On the upper level of this society, we got a bigger land, which was a union of these smaller fields. And so, on the greatest level, the tribe was just a coalition of blood-related individuals in a patriarchal model, where a father of the family was the leader of the household. He was representing his family, he was representing his household, and he was the main decision maker, representing it in the assembly. What's left nowadays after Prussians is not much. It's mostly in the terms of landscape. We can see in areas of what used to be Prussia is the hill forts that still dot the landscape in Poland, in Lithuania. The hill forts, usually when we see them in the landscape of Europe, they bring up a sense of authority. They are often called castle forts, and castle as a center of power in the land implies aristocratic authority. It implies kingship or princeship or any other sorts of unified rule. In Prussians' case, it was a bit different. I'm going to tell about it later. It was just a means of defense against the invaders, but it didn't hold any centralized power. The image on the left that you can see was taken on the yard of the castle of Olsztyn, or Allenstein in German. This sculpture is probably the most popular example of the so-called Prussian Babas, the religious sculptures of more or less unclear provenance that were created by Prussians and that were interpreted in various ways by researchers over years. Probably the most probable hypothesis is that they were representations of a divinity. Others have proposed that they might have been representations of warriors that went to further lands and they couldn't come back home. They were killed somewhere out there and they still needed to have some sort of a symbolic burial. Perhaps it could be both. Perhaps it could relate somehow to the divine in the person, as all of these Prussian Babas, most of them, they hold very similar, uniform attributes in themselves. They're also very closely related to, they show a lot of similarity to similar stone sculptures, also known as Babas, from the steppe region of the southeastern Europe, of the Eurasian steppe. So that also shows some relation to the steppe peoples and to their models of warrior democracy, of democracy of the free man, who are basically fighters. It does appear that they were mostly objects of cult, positioned, as archaeology shows, in a complex of some religious centers of sacred groves. So, what else we get today from the legacy of the Prussians is this cultural movement that aims to reinstitute their cultural heritage. Because as mainstream history tells us, these people were wiped out completely somewhere around 17th century after the conquest by the Teutonic Order. They were trampled, and then what happened to the leftover population in the 17th century was a mixture of Swedish conquest that ravaged through the countryside, and also of Black Plague that made another comeback in that time. And then the history claims that official history basically claims that they were done. It was done with the Prussians at that moment. Nonetheless, there is still a lot of people, out of which at least one is sitting somewhere among us, I'm not going to point my fingers, who proposed this vision of Prussian heritage still being present in the lands of former Prussia, and still being able to be reconstituted. What you see here is a reconstructed flag of a proposed Prussian nation. The shape and the color of the flags, it was taken from sculptures showing Prussian warriors from the castle of Malbork. They were carrying shields with exactly these colors, these exact belts, but without the bare-headed figure in the middle. This one, in turn, comes from a later description of a Prussian temple and of a flag depicting main Prussian deities. And also, you can see underneath there is this shield depicting what's interpreted to be a mythical representation of ancestor, a man who has a bare head to signify his primordialness and to signify his sort of wildness, but he's also dressed, he also has a body of a man, so he's a creature of culture after all, just a very primordial one, possessing primordial qualities. So, the most important element, the most important reason why I'm speaking of Prussians as proto-anarchists is their model of rule. It was, I believe it has a more official name, maybe in English. I think it might be called assembly system, assembly democracy, a tribal democracy where all free men have a vote, exactly one vote, no more, no less. And you don't get any man taking part in an assembly that has higher power over everyone else, higher official power at least, because still it comes to be turns out to be quite obvious that a lot of people, they tend to create more influence over others without officially being given such a status. They just possess it from a different source than a man-made law. And so in Prussian society, every man, every head of the household was able to vote, was able to have a voice his voice was heard at the assembly. And a free man was, as I said, head of the household. And every man that reached a certain age, a certain sort of what do you say? Niepodległość. Independence in life. After reaching a certain age, he was pushed out of his household. He was either given a piece of land from his father's possessions, or if there was too many people in his field already, then he had to go out into the wilderness, which there was plenty of, and he had to create his own household in both cases. So a Prussian man, a young man of Prussian origin, was never given his own house. He was, except for the one son that just, for the last son that got the household from his dying father. But most of the sons, they were forced to go out into the wilderness and build their own existence. In 9th century, in early medieval times, we got a relation from a traveler from Anglo-Saxon lands named Wulfstan, who was traveling to the Baltics by appointment of the King Alfred. And he described the Esti, the probable progenitors of what we later known as Prussians, as having many kings, and were nobles. They drink fermented mare's milk, and common folk drinks mead. This also points to this direction of steppe ancestry, sort of, because no one except for Prussians in this area had this many customs connected to horses, to horsemanship. No one drank kumis, this fermented mare's wine. That was a very special artifact. And how did they create rule? How did they organize their societies? Well, except for just having those assemblies, these assemblies were also tasked with choosing the right people for right functions. So the person who was known as being the most skilled with warfare was just pushed forward as the best chieftain for war times, as long as they agreed, as long as they felt themselves able to do that. Assembly also had to agree on what sort of war actions were necessary in the period. If a tribe was directly involved, was directly endangered by attack from the outside, they needed to take some proper action, and it was essentially the only time when entire community of a field, of this group of households, had to somehow react. All the free men were tasked with taking up arms and going to defend their land. Failing to do so could result in death. The people that didn't show up with arms were sentenced to death, and this is, as far as I know, the only point in which an individual was forced to go to war in defense of their own homeland. So I'll introduce you a little bit more to the social structure, to the administrative sort of. There wasn't administration, but the territorial divisions of the Prussians, and how a certain field would work. Because a lot of people, when they think of a typical early medieval European community, they come with a picture of a village. Sometimes this village has some sort of a stronghold, a sort of defensive structure in the middle where people could easily flock into and defend themselves, and also it was also it was a place of authority. In Prussian context, we had nothing like that. The little land, the basic territorial unit, was a group of homesteads that were divided significantly from each other. Probably in a case of a very crowded field called Lauks in Prussian language, the neighbors could see each other from their houses, but in the cases of newly founded Laukses where there wasn't many settlers, they were divided from each other so that they could freely use any of the land that was around them. You need to know that majority of the area of Prussia at that time was swamp and forest. So that was the main natural border, actually the only border that was dividing fields from each other. Once they reached that border, that was impossible to incorporate it into agricultural systems, of any sorts. They just created this boundary and they had to create also another field. And the next son of any family that had to move out of his farm was basically a pioneer. And so that was the defense system that kept Prussians isolated from the rest of the world for quite a long time, letting them live on the outskirts of Europe, not being threatened and being able to maintain this relatively liberal sort of government. These swamps and lakes and rivers, they were also marked with hill forts, like the one you could see in the picture in the beginning, and they were not hosting soldiers full time, so to say. People were only assigned to take care of a hill fort on the assembly, on the tribal assembly. They could either volunteer or they were chosen from the people as the most able to do that. People were generally expected to show some sort of interest in the well-being of the field, but there was no practical way of forcing anyone. It was just a sense of prestige that pushed them, because that's what made man a man at the time. So, whenever a son wanted to leave his household, he had to go into the wilderness, and he didn't have any inheritance from his father, so he had to carry for the business himself. Hypothetically, he could get some initial materials, some initial tools for that, but at some point, even if he was settling originally in the territory of his original Lauks, he still had to develop his holdings into the wilderness somehow, if there were any left in the area, because a Prussian homestead, by the decision of the assembly, needed to have enough fields, enough pasture lands to maintain all of its members. So as much, depending on how many wives, how many slaves, how many children, how many dependent relatives of other sorts a household, a father of the household had, he was also assigned a certain area. In this area of a field, there were also, besides the fields that were privately owned by certain masters of the household, by certain free men, there were also communal fields, which served as a sort of backup material for harder times. because it was expected that none of the members of this field could be left alone in times of hardship. And it is said by one of the chroniclers that ventured into the Prussian land to conduct Christianizing mission. It was said by him that among them, whenever a beggar appears, it is a custom that they can just wander from house to house and freely feast with the people living there at any time they want. It was expected to be a norm to invite these people. So, to develop this topic of inheritance, when a man died, he was placed in his household for some period of time, anywhere from a week to a month, or even several months, in the case of wealthier people. Prussians did this by preserving the body of the father, probably by the usage of ice that was placed in a hole dug up in the ground, and that's at least one hypothesis. The sources from the time period don't really tell us how exactly they did it, but Christian chroniclers were quite amazed at this mysterious ability of theirs to preserve the body in the house for such a long period. Over this time, all the relatives and friends of that deceased individual would come around to the house, and they would feast on what was left by him, on the food, on the alcohol. It was sort of a post-mortem potlatch, you could say. They would just take everything that they could find, at least from food and drinks. We don't really have enough details to assume if any of the unedible stuff was taken away. It could have, but we have a separate procedure for that. After all the feasting was done with, the Prussians would gather up all of the movable wealth of the deceased. All the jewelry, all the weapons, basically all the things that you cannot eat and you can't pick them up from the ground. So the house stays where it was, the fields stay where they were. Technically, you could pick up a cow, and cows were also taken into this idea of movable goods. They would take all of them, put them into 6, sometimes more, sometimes less, adequately to the wealth of the individual. They would put them into piles, set on a different distances, and sort of like concentric way from the household. And then all the men from the land who possessed horses would gather up and they would race to those piles, while the one placed furthest from the house was the biggest one, having the most valuable things that the deceased possessed, and the one closest to the house was the poorest one, like still something, but definitely not as much as the further ones. And all the people possessing horses, if they wanted to, of course, they would race, and that's how the Prussians redistributed all their wealth. There was no sorts of inheritance after the father to the sons. Like I said before, the sons had to deal with these things themselves, and what happened to the family members who were left without the supervision of the father? Well, the first wife was probably always cremated with her husband. As cruel as it may appear to us today, we have also news of Prussian wives committing mass suicides when they learned, for example, of their husbands' deaths on the battlefield. We have one relation of 50, for example, 50 warriors dying on a battlefield, and whenever their wives would learn about it, they would just immediately take their own lives. Apparently, it was a cultural feature among the old Baltics that among the old Balts, that they wouldn't really value material life here and there as much as a thing to uphold by any price. They would take their lives quite easily in hopes of a better reincarnation later on. And all the older members of the family, like the rest of the wives, the dependent family members, the slaves, they would go in direction from to the sons of the deceased, to first the firstborn son, and then everyone else to the other sons. If the deceased had no son, he probably had some other male relatives. If he had no other male relatives that could pick up those family members, those slaves, they were somehow still redistributed by the assembly. Other forms of redistribution that helped with not creating too much wealth centralization in the society was also what happened to the warlords. Since war was basically one of the easiest ways, or one of the most obvious ways for a Prussian man to get rich, they had a procedure that 1/3 of the loots from any raids went to the gods. So they were given to the priesthood, taking care of the sacred grove, and they would later burn or otherwise destroy all of them, supposedly. I don't really know if we have any sources that tell us if some of them were kept by the priesthood, or they were just, or if the priesthood was maintained from the communal fields by the rest of the community. It wouldn't seem like priesthood created some sort of institution over all of Prussia, because there are no written or archaeological sources pointing towards any sort of religious center. We have one relation of a later chronicler who was writing already after the conquest of Prussia. He describes a place called Romove and a man of a function called Krive, or Krive Krivaitis, so like the priest of the priests, who was presiding over it. But as he was writing later, it can't really be proved that he had any reasonable sources, and no sources from the time period when Crusaders were conquering Prussians tell us that they had any sort of religious centers other than their own local sacred spaces in their fields, in their separate fields. It is said that Prussians were not letting any foreigners into them, so they were taking special care of the water sources and of certain woods. What priests did in a society, except for conducting offerings, they were also seen as intermediaries between the living and the dead, and taking care of the proper procedure of transporting the dead to the other side. We have a relation of one priest who, when the family of the deceased was mourning after him, he was soothing their sadness with a vision of that he supposedly saw in his dreams, or saw it in the sky, of the father riding on a horse with an eagle on his arm, in full armor, riding onto the other land. people were supposed to reincarnate into other forms that were equivalent to what they achieved in this life. So basically whatever you could reach in this life, it went with you to another, and you would either reincarnate as a plant or an animal, or as a human being, maybe richer, maybe wealthier, but seen as a straight continuum, without any hopes for salvation for a poor man who was not able to create his wealth. He was basically going to repeat the whole process until he makes any sort of change. So one motive, important historical motive that lent Poland its first official saint, and that is the main source of imagery, or main source of imagination for people who hear about Prussians nowadays, is the story of Saint Adalbert. He is considered saint because he tried to spread Christianity among the Prussians, but ended up being killed by them. And this is where the story usually ends. It's just dirty pagans living in the forest and being afraid of the light of Christ. And so, not knowing what this man wants from them, they just decided to kill him. A couple interesting passages that we can take out from a couple of written down stories of Saint Adalbert's life point us in a direction of why they didn't get along too well with the Prussians. When he was sent, he embarked on a mission to Prussia with some of his disciples. He was led through by one of the overseers of one of the border posts. He somehow convinced him for that, and then later he went directly into the sacred grove. As I told, it was not possible for any outsiders to go into them, and probably Prussians themselves also needed some sort of ritual cleansing before visiting any of these spaces, and he basically camped there. When he was caught, a whole assembly of the locals gathered around him, and we have a story of them approaching to him with great anger and shouting and threats of violence directly towards them. And they gave arguments against him, such as that the ones of his like, they bring famine to the land. When they will be led to stay there, the crops will not grow. And finally, despite all the arrogant moves that Adalbert still made in direction of the Prussians, not trying to be respectful at all, he was sentenced to exile, and he was told that he should go beyond the river back to the Slavic lands where he came from, and if he shall come back from there, his head will be chopped off. That was a literal promise that they kept. Just after 5 days, Saint Adalbert came again with new spirits for his soon-to-be-gained martyrdom, and so his head was severed and placed on a spear. And from the descriptions of life of Saint Adalbert, we can see that this whole procedure was probably deeply ritualistic. We can see very similar behaviors present in for example, Slavic communities, even as late as end of 19th or beginning of 20th century, which had to do with sort of repelling the evil, the snake, the dragon, or the giant who brought misfortune to the land. And it is also hypothesized that the placement of his head on a spike might have something to do with ritualistic recreation of the world, similar to Nordic mythology, where you get a motif of dismembering the body of the giant Ymir and creating the world from his different body parts. The sky was created from his head, so the placement of the head on a high point could probably symbolically imply recreation of fertility from the dragon that was basically that was perceived to be the essence of Saint Adalbert. Well, as I said before, the men of the Prussian communities were largely equal in a political sense. Each homestead had their own decisions to be made and were not forced by the assembly, except for situations of the whole community being under threat. But then there was also apparent status that was so apparent that the Christians, the Crusaders conquering the land could visibly, could definitely notice that there is something going on, that not all men are equal in this society. Maybe they are created equal, let's say, but they are not, they do not act in an equal manner. They were called nobles, the higher ones in the status pyramid, called nobles by the Crusaders, Witting by the Prussians. And the only thing that gave them this status was the amount of wealth that they amassed through warfare or through trade. They came from families they usually came from families which had traditional warfare, many generations of dealing with war, so they were expected to take up this life path. If they didn't succeed to it, they either died, or before then they could maybe change a trade. They could just become a simple farmer, which was probably not as prestigious and definitely not as it definitely didn't give so much wealth, but also movement in the other direction was very much possible. So a simple farmer who was still conducting some sort of warfare in his life whenever occasion arose and he needed to get richer, he could always join a military campaign, let's say, to use a lofty word, an attack basically on other communities. And he could sort of develop himself on this warrior path. We see from chronicles that these nobles, they had much more political importance than the common free man. They still had only one voice in the assembly if there was any specific decision to be made, but they tended to usually be the ones to come with initiative for taking attacks, making attacks onto other communities. They would be the ones who were the first to be listened to after the original settler of the feud. The original settler of the feud was the first one to be listened to. And then naturally, sort of, like, we don't really need to develop this very specific idea of a noble. It was just a respected individual who was visibly more aggressive, visibly more intelligent, visibly more spontaneous probably, and willing to risk his life for status and for wealth. So these people were more often than not tasked with taking care of the hill forts on the borderlands. They were tasked with various functions that needed to be taken care of. 5 minut? Dobrze. So, as I mentioned, there was a lot of slaves in the Prussian society. It was described very, very vividly among by Christian chroniclers, specifically by the ones serving the Teutonic Order. They were mostly serving the ones who were higher in power, the nobles that I just described, because the nobles were mostly busy with training themselves in the art of war, with political involvement in their community, and with hunting, with training themselves also. These sort of typically aristocratic duties and leisurely activities. Prussians took slaves, but never from their own community. There was no way for a member of the community to become a slave in his own group. Even if he became impoverished, even if his house burned down, he had no other family to take care of him, he was a beggar, he was still taken care of, and he couldn't be sold into slavery. The only way for that would be to be taken a slave by another community, which wasn't frequently the case, as all the able-bodied men were killed if an attack taken place on another Prussian community, if they could, of course, overpower the community so much as to completely conquer it. They usually killed all the grown men, and they would take women and children that they could, of course, catch. They would take them as slaves. So, to think about it, it was the only reasonable way to protect themselves from vengeance from these men that were attacked by, that were taken, that were attacked, and otherwise they could just basically run off to the forest and start something again. And then the Prussians were still treated as sort of a member of the community, member of the family, as ironic as it might seem, as it might sound. Children that were taken as slaves, they spent all of their lives living with the family, and their status as a slave might have not even been fully understood until forming of some political, social consciousness. So we got a lot of stories from the time of from the time of Teutonic conquest, where we have stories of slaves who are almost as if equal status to their masters, and who accompanied them through all of their life, and they would have a completely friend-to-friend, as if brothers relationship. But then it wasn't, of course, foolproof. A lot of cases that we hear of, where lifelong slaves would in the end rebel against their former masters, against maybe their friends or let's say foster brothers, and they would take up an occasion that the Teutonic Order proposed to them of a new life, of a higher status, of more possibilities that they would be able to take up, and that was probably one of the main causes why the Prussian independence came to an end. Podsumowanie. Okay. So, when the Teutonics finally conquered most of the land, they started introducing the procedure of uprooting this local community that was never aimed at conquering other territories. It was never aimed at moving or stretching the influence, like settling some other areas. And it was always a very organic structure of families living in their land from generation to generation. So what Teutonics did was they had to uproot the people directly from their lands and move them en masse to other areas of Prussia. That's what happened. We got relations of whole tribes being moved from one end of Prussia to another. And later on, the Prussians were sort of created as the Prussians were moved to the very side of the new society that was created, where the German settlers were the full scale, like full rights member of it, and the Prussians, well, they were marginalized into side communities, which still maintained their culture. They were one of the only examples of pagans that went official baptism under Teutonic Order rule, but they would not really undergo any syncretism. We got relations of Prussian populations still worshipping their gods and conducting their rituals well into 17th century, and it wouldn't happen like it did in Lithuania or Poland or other lands around there, where figures of saints would syncretize with figures of gods. They would basically still call the gods by their old name. And I think you could see this strong mindset of independence carrying over through hundreds of years, and that was visible also in the very beginnings of the conquest of Prussia, that once a prince from Poland would go into Prussia and he would fight around a couple of hill forts, and it seemed to him that he has gained full submission of these territories, and they claimed to him that, okay, we are going to pay you tribute, but he only actually could gain enough, he could only gain submission from a couple of territories, but majority of the population, it had no sort of central rule. It was completely on its own. So by the force of the will of the majority of Prussia, basically any sort of dependence on the invaders was just moved away after a while, because anyway the invaders weren't even really able to penetrate well into the territory, except for hard winters where all of the swamps would freeze, and they would allow them only then for the soldiers to pass. Other than that, there were also ways of traveling between those territories, but they were only known to the members of a certain community, members of a certain feud. A feud in this border region of swamps and lakes, it had system of bridges called kultrinda in Lithuanian language, that were invisible. You couldn't see them from the surface, but if you were from that community, then of course you knew where to look for passage, and that was how treason of mostly slaves and nobles wishing to get out from this very egalitarian clan-based system came to finalize the downfall of Prussia, as they were the only ones who could spill the beads on where the bridges are. And that's it. Thank you.